It was July 1943. Southeastern Sicily was a furnace of wind, limestone, and burned yellow wheat. Italian soldiers stood along a low ridgeline west of Gela men, who had fought mostly partisans or defended coastlines that rarely saw enemy movement. Their boots were powdered white from the chalky earth. They wiped sweat from the bridge of their noses and squinted through field glasses. At first it was only vibration, just trembling across the soil. A dull bass pulse that seemed impossible to measure or locate. Then the sound rose. Deep, mechanical, continuous. It was not sporadic like artillery. It was not distinct like aircraft. It was mass. It was motionless. It was machines made to move, forever climbing the hills with brutal patience. Over the horizon came an American armored column, not in a straight, neat parade, but spread in depth, in layers like a moving industrial ecosystem. Rows of Shermans, half-tracks, support trucks, bulldozers, fuel carriers, maintenance vehicles, and a mobile nation rolling toward them. Italian sergeants lowered their binoculars. Some whispered they had never seen vehicles move inland so fast. And that shocked disbelief is where this story begins and demands context to understand why those Italian soldiers were stunned on that ridge. We must go backward to the condition of Italy in the spring of 1943 and what the Axis had just lost. Because Sicily did not happen in a vacuum. Sicily was the first domino. After a catastrophic sequence, the North African campaign had ended only weeks earlier, in May 1943. More than 230,000 Axis troops surrendered in Tunisia, a loss so large that some historians argue it had the same psychological impact on Hitler as Stalingrad. Because Tunisia didn't only represent lost troops, it represented a lost possibility, lost mobility, lost credibility. Italy had already been bleeding steadily before Tunisia collapsed in Greece, in East Africa, in the desert, at sea. But Tunisia was the signal none in Rome could avoid. The surface of the Mediterranean was now an allied lake. There was no longer a functioning Axis land front in Africa. There was nowhere else to hide the strategic reality. Rome was now the nearest reachable strategic prize. Every Italian general understood this. Every Allied general understood this. And the population, exhausted after 3 full years of war, sensed it too. Civilian morale was not just lowering, it was eroding. The Italian public had endured rationing, propaganda, rhetoric of early war glory, but the results never matched the words. They were promised an empire. They received ruin. Factories could not sustain wartime output. Industrial leadership was fragmented. Italy had pockets of very competent officers and some individual formations that fought well, but the institution was brittle. Italian heavy industry could not produce enough high-quality tanks, aircraft, radios, trucks, or ammunition to sustain a prolonged mechanized war. Germany had to keep reinforcing Italy's fronts, which bred resentment between the two governments and worsened the friction between German and Italian field officers. Meanwhile, the Allies sensed something new in the air. American industry has matured. The United States had crossed the threshold from mobilizing to projecting, from building to landing, from training to applying pressure at scale. And now the Allies held operational freedom in the Mediterranean. British planners wanted to invade Sicily as the stepping stone to the European mainland. Churchill famously called Sicily the soft underbelly of the Axis. He was partly wrong because Sicily was not soft tactically, but he was right strategically because Sicily led directly toward the emotional center of Italian war will. If Sicily fell, the Italian government would be politically exposed, Rome would be threatened, and Mussolini would no longer be protected by distance. So the Allies designed Operation Husky, an amphibious invasion of Sicily to force Italy out of the war and open a gateway to Europe's southern flank. Italian generals saw the danger but lacked the tools and trust to counter it. Hitler did not believe Sicily would be the target. He misread intelligence and spread his forces. Italian coastal defenses were uneven, some beaches fortified, others neglected. Many coastal defense troops in Sicily were local conscripts, not hardened veterans. They were armed with fixed artillery and machine guns, but with almost no mobile reserves. They were positioned as static guard units, not dynamic armored defense. And that is the central structural weakness that will define the rest of this documentary. Italy's defense was designed for static war. America arrived with a mobile war. And that difference between static and mobile, between immobile, guns and roving industrial columns would become lethal within the first 48 hours on the island, because Sicily was not only an island. It was a test. It was the test of industrial modernity, the test of mechanized output, the test of whether a democracy's factories could outperform a dictatorship's dreams. Italy could not replace what it was losing. America could replace what it was sending. And that imbalance would now manifest physically on dirt roads on scorching slopes, where armored battalions simply kept coming, refueled by an industrial base that could feed machines like organisms. Sicily was the moment where Italy would witness, in real time, what unstoppable production looked like, which leads us to the next step: how the Allies planned that landing, and what precise armored forces were assigned to crack open the island. The planning table for Operation Husky was not improvised. It was the largest amphibious assault in history up to that moment, larger than any Pacific landing, larger than anything seen in the Mediterranean, and it required synchronization across naval, air, and armored branches at a level Italy had never achieved. The Allied landing force for Sicily was two armies: British 8th Army under Bernard Montgomery, U.S. 7th Army under George S. Patton. British would land on the right, east coast, push up the Catania Plain, and draw the bulk of Axis defensive weight. The Americans would land on the left, south coast, secure beachheads, seize road hubs, then expand west and north. But here's the crucial part. The American role was not just take beaches. The American role was bring industrial mobility onto European soil. We often simplify the U.S. Army of WW2 as just infantry with Shermans. That is not accurate. America's advantage was the entire logistical organism behind armor. It was not only tanks. It was the fuel trucks, ammo carriers, bulldozers, maintenance teams, aviation spotters, mobile HQs, Red Ball-style trucking units, beach engineers, Navy beach battalions, all working as a synchronized mechanized ecosystem, and Sicily was the first European demonstration of that. On the American landing roster were 1st Infantry Division, the big red one, 45th Infantry Division, 3rd Infantry Division, Rangers, airborne elements, multiple tank battalions, equipped with M4 Sherman plus M3 Stuart. The M4 Sherman was not invulnerable, but it was extremely reliable and maintainable. It could run on mediocre fuel. It could be repaired in the field fast. It had room for radios. It had standardized parts. Italy, by contrast, had scattered production models, many without radios, many with thin armor, many mechanically delicate, meaning tanks could not be massed in sustained mobile action. While Italians built tanks as specialized pieces, the U.S. built tanks as products. America treated war like a manufacturing problem, and Sicily was where that philosophy would touch hostile soil. Even before the landing, intelligence and deception helped shape the battlefield. Operation Mincemeat, the famous corpse with fake letters deception, was part of the larger Allied effort to make Hitler believe the next strike would fall on Sardinia or Greece. And the deception worked. German armored reserves were misplaced. So on the night of July 9-10, when American and British landing ships approached Sicily, the enemy central reserves were not where they needed to be, and the Italian coastal garrisons were undersupported, undertrained for mechanized reaction, and psychologically hollowed by the Tunisian disaster. The weather almost canceled the invasion. High winds wrecked airborne drops. Gliders crashed into the sea. Paratroopers fell scattered across fields. But the naval convoys kept going, because the Allies were gambling big. If Sicily fell, Mussolini's Italy might crack politically and Germany would be forced to commit major resources to defend Italy, weakening their eastern and western fronts. Sea control, air superiority, industrial-scale logistics, these were the Allied pillars. Italy could not match any of them. And as soon as the first bulldozers rolled off landing craft at the beaches near Gela and Licata, American engineers began carving roads, clearing mines, hauling heavy equipment ashore so armor could move. Italy had never faced this kind of tempo. They had never faced an opponent who could land armored columns and the machinery to feed those armored columns in the same tidal movement. And that is the mental shock that would soon break through every Italian command post. Not just that the Americans brought tanks, but that the Americans brought an entire armored civilization. With them, to the Italian defenders inland, that difference would not be theoretical. It would become visible, audible, material, in the form of columns that did not stall, did not pause, did not sputter, but simply rolled mile after mile, as if the island's geography was not an obstacle, but a map to be printed on. And the Italian soldiers watching that mechanized mass roll forward would soon realize that the battle was not only tanks versus guns, it was systems versus systems, which now leads us into the core human and tactical angles. Why one side was emotionally collapsing while the other side was accelerating. There were multiple layers to the shock Italians felt in Sicily. It was not simply fear of tanks. It was the sudden realization that they were facing a type of enemy they had not prepared for psychologically, tactically, industrially, or culturally. We begin with the human angle. Italian troops on Sicily were not cowards. Many of them were family men called from poor southern villages. Many were brave, loyal soldiers, but they had never seen industrial tempo applied to land war. The average Italian infantryman in Sicily had trained for static defense, holding a position, firing fixed guns, using the terrain as a barrier. But the American concept of war was not built on barriers. American doctrine was mobility and sustainment. Keep moving. Keep feeding the machine. Move armor through gaps, then use logistics to keep that armor running. Italian soldiers were used to seeing tanks as rare, precious, specialized. For Americans, tanks were consumables. If a tank broke, it was replaced. If a tank ran out of fuel, fuel convoys arrived. If a road was blocked, engineers blasted a new one. This psychological difference mattered more than any single gun caliber. Because war is not only physics. War is perception. When Italian platoons saw columns of American Shermans and half-tracks rolling inland without hesitation, the first emotion was not always terror. Sometimes it was disbelief. It felt unreal that metal could move that long without failing. Italian trucks broke constantly. Roads were poor. Fuel was rationed. Supply columns were fragile. Italians saw war as a resource problem. Americans saw war as a resource solution. This explains one of the most under-discussed angles of Sicily. American confidence was not arrogance. It was industrial self-awareness. U.S. soldiers in 1943 understood something. They came from a land where the factories ran all night. They came from a country that controlled the oil, the rubber, the steel, the shipyards. They knew that if they lost a tank today, the United States could build 5 more tomorrow. That belief is a weapon. Now we move to the Italian command angle. Italian mid-level officers in Sicily were frustrated. They filed reports. They radioed for mobile reserves. They requested German armor support. But German armored strength was limited on Sicily at the opening of the Husky. And Italian doctrine had no coherent response to enemy mechanized penetration. In war, doctrine is destiny. Italy had doctrine for defending beaches. Italy had doctrine for mountain ambushes. Italy did not have a doctrine for rapid counter-mechanized maneuver. American officers, especially in armored units, trained for exploitation. This was the Patton School. See open space, move fast, break the enemy's decision cycle. And Sicily's geography, despite its mountains, gave corridors of movement. Once the beaches were secure around Gela, the Americans did not stop to consolidate slowly. They surged forward toward key road junctions, Piano Lupo, Nishemi, and beyond. Every road seized created an artery. Every artery seized allowed more machines to flow. Italian officers realized this too late. This is the moment where human and tactical angles merge. Italian soldiers were not just outfought. They were out-timed. They could not adjust their operational rhythm fast enough. The psychological impact spread faster than any armored column. Rumors traveled between units that the Americans have endless tanks. Even when totally inaccurate, American armored numbers were not infinite. The rumor was logical from what Italians saw. A broken Italian platoon on a hill might see 3 tanks 1 hour, 5 the next, a dozen trucks after that, and never see where they came from or how they were supplied. Italy fought tactically, America fought systemically. And the full shock of that systemic approach was about to be tested in a specific flashpoint where the first Italian defensive lines cracked under the weight of mechanized movement. Now we examine the sharper, mechanical angles where doctrine meets steel, and where design philosophy becomes battlefield outcome. The American M4 Sherman is often criticized in modern pop history for its vulnerability against later Panthers and Tigers in 44-45, but that criticism misses the truth of 1943. In Sicily, the Sherman was not a poor machine. It was a dominant archetype of what Italy could not produce. Italy's medium tanks like the Carro Armato M1340 or later M1441 were compromises. Thin armor, low-velocity guns, inadequate radios, weak engines that overheated in Mediterranean summer. Italian tanks were tactical instruments. Shermans were operational instruments. A Sherman battalion was not just tanks. It was fuel point, spare parts, recovery vehicles, maintenance teams, communication nodes. And that is the critical angle. The Americans did not bring tanks. They brought the entire maintenance universe which kept those tanks moving. When Italian anti-tank guns knocked out a Sherman, and they did, more rolled behind it. When a road washout blocked progress, engineers rebuilt the road. The Italian system was never designed for this level of sustained motion. We now add the aviation angle. America's armored thrusts in Sicily were supported by something Italy could not generate in quantity. Close air support plus tactical reconnaissance at scale. USF and naval aircraft flew constant patrols over the advancing columns. Not only did this suppress Italian artillery, it gave American ground commanders real-time intelligence. And that intelligence fed mobility with confidence. No commander charges fast into unknown terrain unless he believes he can correct the course fast. Air visibility gave American armor the courage to push deeper. For Italian local commanders, this created the feeling that American attacks were everywhere at once. They would see dust clouds of moving columns one direction, then hear engines from another. The psychological map began to distort. This is another underappreciated angle. For the Italian defenders, the battlefield seemed to have multiple American armies because the Americans moved faster than expected. Now the leadership angle. George S. Patton was not yet the mythic general of later campaigns. Sicily is where his operational thinking first gained global weight. Patton understood something essential. Speed is not a tactic. Speed is a strategy of erosion. If you move fast enough, the enemy staff cannot react in time. If the enemy staff cannot react, defensive strengths cannot be coordinated. If strengths cannot be coordinated, the front dissolves. Italian generals tried to reseal the front east of Gela. They issued orders. They attempted to regroup. They attempted counterattacks, but American tempo destroyed their ability to shape the battlefield. And now the moral angle. Italian soldiers were not fighting for an idea that still lived. By 1943, even loyal men sensed that the fascist regime had failed in every promise. They sensed the war would not deliver prosperity, prestige, or empire. But American soldiers were fighting with the confidence of a nation rising, not declining. They were the physical expression of a country at the peak of industrial creation, not industrial exhaustion. That difference of belief matters more in war than any single caliber or turret thickness. And Sicily put all these angles, human, tactical, mechanical, industrial, leadership into one crucible. The decisive moment began on the coastal approaches near Gela, when the Americans had barely anchored their boots into Sicilian soil. Italian and German units, acting on fragmentary reports, launched fierce counterattacks to drive the invaders back into the sea. Mortar fire cracked across the dunes. Coastal guns hammered the beaches. Italian Bersaglieri and German Panzergrenadiers struck hard. For hours, the outcome was not guaranteed. The Americans were fresh but vulnerable. Landing craft were still unloading. Ammunition supply lines were still fragile. But then the U.S. armored units began to appear. The first Shermans came in not as a slow, careful drip, but in groups rolling off LST ramps, passing through bulldozed sand exits, and throwing dust clouds into the Sicilian air. Italian commanders, watching from forward positions and command posts, had assumed the Americans would land mostly infantry, not heavy armor this fast. This was the climax turning point. American armored columns entered the fight before the Italians finished organizing their own counterattacks. The Italian counterattacks were local, disconnected, courageous, but without systemic weight. They were brave thrusts by individual units. But brave thrusts cannot halt a mobilized system. Shermans moved inland on multiple dirt tracks simultaneously. Halftracks followed them, not in neat columns but staggered, pushing fighting elements to multiple fronts. American artillery battalions, already ashore, began to stabilize the beachhead with massed fire. A single Italian officer later wrote in his diary, found after the war, "They did not stop. We expected pauses. They had no pauses." This was not a Hollywood drama. This was the exact mechanical truth. The U.S. mechanized structure eliminated pauses by design. Once the Shermans gained foothold inland, they did not sit and trade fire. They maneuvered. They hunted enemy guns. They flowed like a living organism with many limbs. Where the Italians expected linear fight, they encountered distributed fight. Infantry advanced supported by armor. Armor advanced supported by artillery. Artillery advanced supported by logistics. These layers created a tactical mosaic that overwhelmed any single Italian battalion's line of sight. Italian anti-tank crews fired and hit some Shermans, but even after a hit, more American armor and trucks kept arriving behind dust curtains. Every Italian officer on those front lines saw the same phenomenon. The American war machine had no visible endpoint. No matter how many vehicles appeared, more could be heard on the horizon. The psychological weight of industrial continuity crushed morale. This is what created the sensation reported by multiple Italian survivors that the Americans had infinite tanks. They did not. But perception beats arithmetic in battlefield psychology. Within 24 to 36 hours, the first layer of Italian coastal defenses fractured. And when a static defense fractures under a mobile attacker, the attacker begins to dictate geography. American armored columns pushed inland toward high ground. Road junctions fell. Italian retreat routes began to compress. Communications broke down. And this is the exact moment where disbelief took over, where Italian commanders realized that the Americans were not landing to fight on beaches. They were landing to conquer operational space at a tempo Italy could not match. Next, these columns would exploit gaps and begin the race across Sicily, toward the island's heart, and then toward Palermo, where the collapse turned from frontline shock into strategic disintegration. Once the beachhead at Gela stabilized and the first counterattacks were beaten back, the U.S. armored doctrine shifted instantly from stabilization to exploitation. Patton's commanders did not wait for perfect telegraphed orders. They used initiative. They hunted roads. They hunted junctions. They hunted for momentum. And Sicily, though mountainous, has seams. Inside Sicily there exists a network of inland roads that, if captured fast, fracture the island's interior like glass. Those roads do not run north-south like on a modern organized grid. They run diagonally, imperfectly, like ancient veins. Americans understood this because engineers and recon teams studied Sicily's road network before landing. They knew which arteries fed which towns. They knew which bottlenecks could open the west. And so U.S. armored columns did not advance like a single fist. They advanced like 5 fingers spreading, probing, seizing. This is how the drive toward Palermo formed. Not as a single mass, but as a systemic infiltration of mobility. Italian battalion commanders tried to fall back in order. But retreat requires options, and the Americans were stealing their options and paving them into new routes. Italian officers in the west of Sicily received reports that American armored spearheads had appeared where they believed the enemy could not possibly arrive this fast. This was not magic. It was not Hollywood surprise heroics. It was mechanics. It was logistics. It was the effect of a military machine that could fuel itself, repair itself, sustain itself, feed itself while moving, and Patton exploited that. Sicily would become his baptism as the general of the movement. He made a decision many British strategists did not expect. He drove for Palermo, fast. He cut across the island westward, not only to seize terrain, but to shatter the Italian command's mental map. Because Palermo was not just a port. Palermo was the psychological capital. Palermo was prestigious. Palermo was the symbol of Italian state authority in Sicily. If Palermo fell, the idea of defending Sicily became a hollow fiction. Patton's Columns drove with a fluency of mechanized violence Italy had no counter-grammar for. Shermans moved at the front. Recon jeeps ran ahead. Half-tracks full of infantry followed. Artillery rolled behind. Engineers cleared obstacles. Fuel convoys fed each artery. And that is the climax. Italy was not defeated by one battle. Italy was defeated by tempo. Tempo is the silent weapon of industrial war. In the west of Sicily, some Italian units surrendered without firing shots. Not because they lacked bravery, but because they had no viable concept of how to slow a mechanized machine that simply went around every static defense they tried to build. This is what broke them. The sight of American armored columns rolling through small Sicilian towns with dust plumes trailing behind them was not merely tactical defeat. It was a humiliation of a national narrative. It was the final demonstration, to the Italian soldier and to the Italian civilian watching from balconies and farmhouses, that Mussolini's promise of empire was dead. America did not just land in Sicily. America rolled through Sicily, like time itself. And 2 weeks later, on July 22, 1943, Palermo fell. The road to Mussolini's collapse was now open. Italy would never psychologically recover from the sight of American armor moving across its first provincial homeland. And the aftershocks of that collapse would reshape Europe's political structure within days. The fall of Palermo was not a local defeat. It was a signal, and Rome received it. Only 3 days after Palermo's occupation by U.S. forces, on July 25, 1943, Benito Mussolini was removed from power by his own system, his own Grand Council, his own king, his own state that no longer believed his promises. Sicily was not just a battlefield. Sicily was the trigger that caused the fascist regime's internal collapse. Historians often debate whether the coup against Mussolini would have occurred anyway due to war exhaustion, due to the North African losses, due to economic crater. But the timing reveals the truth. Sicily cracked Italy faster than any other defeat, because Sicily was Italian national soil. Tunisia was far away. Ethiopia was colonial. Greece was a foreign gamble. But Sicily was Italy's own island, its own landmass, its own province. And when a foreign mechanized army drove across that soil with winds of dust behind it, when American armored columns rolled into Palermo, Italians knew something fundamental. The war had come home, and Italy could not defend itself. This created a strategic situation Hitler feared most. Italy could exit the Axis and open a new Allied front into the European mainland. Therefore, the aftermath of Sicily was not only political, it was structural. Germany now had to rush reinforcements into Italy. Hitler redeployed divisions, rushed armor, shifted Luftwaffe assets to plug a hole Italy could no longer plug. Italian officers were psychologically broken, but the German general staff was not. They understood exactly what Sicily meant. The Allies had discovered a path into Europe's southern belly, and they had demonstrated the logistics and naval power to exploit it. This is why, in the days after Mussolini fell, Germany executed Operation Achse, the rapid occupation of Italy to prevent Italy from switching sides. Sicily forced Germany into a new front. Sicily forced Germany to fight on ground it did not choose. Sicily forced Germany to play reactive war instead of proactive war, and this is the deep significance. Sicily was the operational moment when the Axis lost initiative permanently. They would never regain it. From this moment forward, the Axis would mostly react to Allied moves, not dictate them. Italy's collapse, accelerated by Sicily's fall, created a cascading effect. Allied forces now had a stepping stone to the mainland. The Mediterranean became fully Allied. Germany had to divert troops from the east, and most importantly, Italy would soon sign an armistice. Sicily's fall did not merely change Italy's government, it changed the mathematical structure of the entire war. After Mussolini's removal, Italy attempted to negotiate secretly with the Allies. By September 8, 1943, Italy signed an armistice, which means Sicily, Palermo, Mussolini removed. Italy out of Axis. That chain reaction began on those dusty roads where Italian soldiers stared at American armor in disbelief. Germany was now forced to occupy its former ally. And this occupation was not theoretical. It consumed 25 to 30 full German divisions over time. Those divisions could have been strengthening the Eastern Front, could have been reinforcing France, could have been facing the American and British buildup in England. Instead, they were tied down inside a collapsing country that no longer wanted the war. This is one of the least appreciated truths in popular memory. Sicily created the manpower starvation that weakened Germany before Normandy. Normandy's success is always told as a beach story, but it was also a numbers story, and Sicily helped strip away those numbers. Meanwhile, the American war machine that rolled through Sicily became a self-validating prototype. Shermans proved they could deploy, land, sustain, exploit, and keep moving against a European opponent. Engineers proved that they could keep fuel and ammunition flowing to columns under heat and dust. Mechanized infantry proved that combined arms was not theory but repeatable practice. Sicily taught the U.S. the Army could play the Continental War not as an apprentice but as an industrial adult. And it taught the world one more thing. America could mobilize industry and translate that industrial output into strategic maneuver on foreign terrain. Italy was strategically defeated in Sicily but intellectually defeated by recognition that its opponent had built a civilization around perpetual motion. And that crushing realization was not only recorded by historians, it was felt by thousands of ordinary Italian soldiers who stood in the dust and sun of July 1943, watching columns of machines that seemed born not in factories, but in infinity. Sicily is often remembered as a warm-up, a stepping stone to a rehearsal before Italy's mainland. But when you peel back the surface, Sicily was a philosophical turning point, because Sicily is the moment the world saw what the American way of war truly was. Not an empire, not a dynasty, not a cult of personality like Hitler or Mussolini, but a nation built on systems. Fuel systems, production systems, transport systems, maintenance systems, command systems, replacement systems. The war for Italy was ideological. The war for Germany was an obsession. War for America was a workflow. And Sicily exposed this contrast like a mathematical equation. Italian troops saw it in the streets in the endless columns of supply, trucks and armored fighting vehicles that just kept appearing, in aircraft that arrived on schedule like a global airline. It was the moment Axis officers realized something horrifying. You weren't fighting a country, you were fighting a process, a nation that could erase losses by manufacturing more units faster than you could destroy them. Sicily gave Eisenhower something he needed even more than territory: confidence. The Allies gained not just a base but a strategic direction. America now knew the path to breaking Hitler was not the fantasy decisive battle but a continuous choke applied through logistics and mobility until the enemy suffocated. Sicily proved the formula, and Italy, the country that once dreamed of a new Roman Empire, became the geography where industrial modernity crushed the last romance of fascist imperialism. The old world died in Sicily. The new world arrived with engines running hot. So when Allied war, correspondents wrote that American tanks seemed to roll out of the sea itself. They were unintentionally poetic, because that is exactly what it was. The ocean, the thing that used to isolate America, became the conveyor belt that delivered American power across the world. Sicily was the first true demonstration of that power on European soil. Palermo was not just captured. Palermo was the moment the Axis realized that this new kind of enemy could not be exhausted, because this new enemy had turned the industrial age into a military religion where production was prayer and mobility was doctrine.